Biotech indexes are tumbling after one of the last veteran leaders departs FDA, and the threat of tariffs darken the skies over biopharma. On today's BioCentury This Week podcast, we'll discuss the state of biotech stocks, the ouster of Peter Marks from FDA, and for a dose of sanity, we'll take a look at Bispecifics for I&I. I'm Jeff Cranmer, and joining me today on the BioCentury podcast are my colleagues
Simona Fishburne, Editor-in-Chief.
Stephen Hansen, Director of Biopharma Intelligence.
Steve Osden, Washington Editor.
And Lauren Martz, Executive Director of Biopharma Intelligence.
Okay, Stephen, I want to turn to you. I know that the XBI has been struggling since it hit a high back in November, and now it is, I think, down around 5% as we record this on Monday evening London time. And are we now back in a biotech bear market?
Yes, yeah. The bear's back, Jeff. That's right. So unfortunately, afraid to bring you such bad news, but yeah. So basically, the XBI's most recent high came on November 11th, as you mentioned, and since then it was nearly back on Friday. We were approaching it very closely, but then today is really sort of plunged it over the edge, and it's down about 24% since just after the elections. And just to give a quick sort of comp to sort of the broader markets, which are also down, but biotech has sort of taken the brunt of this more so than the broader markets. So the Nasdaq Composite, since it had its most recent peak in mid-December, it's off about 15% since then. And then if you look at the S&P 500, that actually had its most recent peak just about a month ago, sort of towards the end of February, but it's off about 9% since then. The broader markets are really taking a beating on tariffs, and I think part of it is just nobody has a good read on what these tariffs are going to look like this week. Supposedly they're coming on Wednesday. We'll see what they include. But the problem is that piled on top of that, so biotech was probably going to be off on the tariffs anyways, based on their implications for future inflation and interest rates and all that sort of broader market macro issues. But then piled on top of that, when Peter Marks resigned over the weekend. So in all of my conversations over the past couple of weeks with buy-siders, almost across the board, their biggest remaining concern, fear, however you want to characterize it, was what happens to FDA. And, this had been the fear since RFK was nominated back in November. Their biggest worry was, is he or is he not going to tinker or dismantle FDA? Like, what's his impact there going to be? And I think, Mark's sort of being arguably the biggest name now that's left since the election. I think this sort of is confirming kind of essentially investors' biggest fears, that this is making FDA's ability to function. It just continually, calls that into question, I think, here.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to make the point that I was talking to some CEOs last week, in fact, the last couple of weeks, and this is even before the news about Peter Marks. What I was hearing from people is that even if their company is fine, even if their families are fine, there is a lot of doom and gloom in the boardrooms. There is a lot of nervousness in the boardrooms. As I said, this was even before. And, some have said it's the worst they remember, maybe the worst since 2008. People are really talking about this from a sentiment point of view, not even specifically where their company is, but from a sentiment point of view. People are very concerned. And, to some degree, that can end up being self-fulfilling. Steve, how are you looking at this?
Look, we're going to talk about Peter Marks's ouster. It wasn't resignation. He was pushed out. We're going to talk about that later in the show. There's also, what I reported last week, the two deputy directors of the Oncology Center of Excellence resigned last week. There's 3,500 staff who are going to be laid off at FDA. We don't know exactly who they're going to be, but that's going to impede FDA's ability to review drugs in a timely way and keep up with technology. There's no way around that. What I wonder is, in addition to all of that, if the markets have baked in the possibility of pharmaceutical-specific tariffs. That's one thing to be concerned about tariffs overall, and as you said, the macroeconomic effects. But there's another question about whether they're actually going to be pharma-specific tariffs. If the markets haven't baked that in, and if the pharmaceutical-specific tariffs are announced this week, then I think there's going to be another plunge.
I think you're right. I mean, I think there definitely is that possibility for another leg down because just given the lack of any detail, right, that's come out of the administration about this sort of next wave of tariffs, I think it's really hard for anyone to try and even get some sort of a guesstimate as to what impact that might have. And so I think that's the real downside risk sort of here for the next week is if there is something specific that is essentially an additional tax on pharma revenues, then you could see a pretty wide leg down again.
And then, Steve, the pharma specific tariffs wouldn't count things like Indian generics or APIs that could get caught up in a broader non-industry specific tariff.
Well,
is that correct?
Yes and no. Okay. So Indian generic drugs would be included in pharma specific tariffs. They're not going to distinguish between, it's quite likely anyway, that they're not going to distinguish between generic and branded drugs. APIs are not included or not likely to be included in pharma specific tariffs, but they would be included in tariffs that could be imposed on or added to existing tariffs on China and India, which are the largest suppliers of APIs in the United States.
So, Steve, I have to ask you this unfair question, perhaps, and I'm sure you're not going to disclose any names, but, there really were, and Stephen, you as well, actually, there really were a lot of people who at the beginning thought that this administration and a fully Republican administration and House and Senate would be good for biotech. I think there are some people who still think the sort of 4D chess philosophy is there and that this will all play out. And I know that pharma leaders have really wanted to, shall I say, not get Zelensky'd. They've wanted to err on the side of caution with respect to the administration and try and work with them to have a seat at the table and to be able to make the case and lobby for their industry. But it seems to me like at what point do they start to speak out? Certainly some have spoken out against, sort of not against vaccines, but against going after vaccines or in favor of vaccines. What are you hearing from those people now? Do they still think that this is a strategy they should continue to pursue?
I think there are several things that are going on. One is that there's a distinction between the way that pharma companies, pharma CEOs, and biotechs look at this. I think that the pharma CEOs have made a conscious decision that their top priority is avoiding international reference pricing, what President Trump calls most favored nation, and changing the IRA's Medicare drug price negotiation program, particularly by eliminating or ameliorating what they call the pill penalty. That's their top priority. The second tier priority, I think, for the pharma companies has been tax policy, particularly changing the way that R&D expenses are accounted for in taxes to reverse changes that were not favorable to the industry in the last tax bill. The biotech industry came out very clearly and said that it was very important to them. Bio President and CEO John Crowley wrote it, and he said it to me in an interview, that it was very important for them to keep Peter Marks in place because they thought that he was critical for the future of cell and gene therapies, among other things. And I think that the biotech industry probably has a greater appreciation of the importance of NIH, which has been severely hurt already by the Trump administration, and many fear that much bigger and worse things are yet to come. I still think that the biotech industry and the pharmaceutical industry are not going to come out and take, a highly adversarial position against the Trump administration or against Robert Kennedy. One of the things that they're both doing is looking for people who claim to have Robert Kennedy's ear. They're looking for ways that they can get to him and perhaps play on the promises that he's made to promote therapies for chronic diseases, maybe play on his anti-big pharma populism to promote policies that would help smaller biotechs. I think that's what they're going to try to do. That is what they are trying to do. How effective it's going to be really remains to be seen. So I don't think that these big structural problems that the biopharma industry is facing as a result of the cuts and changes in government policy, it's not going to be possible to ameliorate them by whispering in Robert Kennedy's ear and getting him to do this or that discrete policy. There's a broad structural problem here, and it really remains to be seen how we're going to navigate through it.
All right, let's go to a quick break, and then we will come back and talk specifically about the ouster of Peter Marks.
BioSentry This Week is brought to you by BioSentry Grand Rounds. Grand Rounds, BioSentry's R&D conference, will return in 2025 to the US and Europe to debate key bottlenecks in translation and unlock scientific breakthroughs with commercial potential. Connect with VCs, academic innovators, and biopharma R&D and BD leaders to explore cutting-edge advancements in early-stage R&D as we dive into disease biology, therapeutic modalities, and enabling technologies. Join us in Chicago, Illinois this June for the second BioSentry Grand Rounds US, and in Cambridge, UK this September for the inaugural Grand Rounds Europe. Register and learn more at biocentrygrandraounds.com.
And of course, Grand Rounds US. It's our second time doing it. Last year was awesome in Nashville. This year, as you heard, will be in Chicago, and it's right after ASCO. So super convenient. Stick around, catch a Cubs game, maybe a White Sox game, and then geek out with Simone and Karen and Selena and the rest of the BioSentry crew. We're putting together a great program, and if you're in Europe, Grand Rounds will be headed to the UK in September. Okay, Steve, Peter Marks's ouster from FDA leaves Richard Pazder as the lone veteran leader at the agency. We mentioned some other folks that left. We did not mention Patrizia Cavazzoni, who left on the last day of the Biden administration, former head of CDER. How did we get here, and how bad is it for FDA?
Well, we don't know exactly. Of course, nobody knows what's going to happen at FDA, but it does create a lot of uncertainty, and it puts it in an increasingly precarious state. Morale is plummeting. They're about to lose 18% of their workforce due to the recent layoffs. As I mentioned earlier, some of the agency's most experienced reviewers and managers, including 2 deputy directors of the Oncology Center of Excellence, have resigned recently. More are planning their exit. This is institutional knowledge, deep knowledge of the details of the science and the medicine and the regulatory aspects of drug regulation that are irreplaceable. They're going to be very difficult anyway to replace. And then we have the concerns that are raised by Peter Marks's departure. Look, he isn't irreplaceable and he wasn't infallible, but his ouster is nonetheless really bad for FDA patients in the biopharma industry. He was ousted in a manner that was intended to demonstrate that HHS Secretary Robert Kennedy Jr. is going to be steering the ship at FDA. The ultimatum for him to resign or be fired was delivered by the acting HHS General Counsel. It isn't clear whether FDA Commissioner Marty Makary was consulted. There's no reason to believe that Makary opposed the decision, or that if he had, Kennedy would have taken his views into consideration. So Makary is starting his tenure in a situation where he's going to have control over day-to-day operations at FDA, but the HHS secretary is going to intervene in ways that HHS secretaries have never done before. Makary is certain to be held responsible for any problems that occur under his leadership. At the same time, the illusion of FDA's independence has been shattered, and the regulation of the nation's medicines and foods is in the hands of a man who's dedicated decades to promoting pseudoscientific conspiracy theories, denigrating civil servants, and profiting from lawsuits against pharmaceutical companies. What could go wrong?
Yeah, I think that this is problematic on so many levels. And you've, obviously highlighted those for us, from what it means in terms of oversight or lack of independence, let's say, of FDA, of people interfering without necessarily a real scientific category or basis in those decisions. Do you think, Steve, that, there's a bunch of people who's going to be listening to this and going, well, I'm not working on mRNA, I'm not in vaccines, I'm working on, bispecifics in whatever. Maybe Lauren will tell us immunology, I&I, immunology and information indication. Do those people just go, I'll just keep my head down, it'll be fine? Or do you think that the ripple effect through FDA out beyond the areas that are, let's say, RFK Jr.'s kind of hot spots, how should people think about this in terms of their own risk?
There's a lot of uncertainty, okay? We don't know for sure that, for example, the 18% of FDA's workforce who have been laid off, we don't know who they are. We don't know what their positions are. We don't know 100% that those layoffs are actually going to happen. They're going to be contested in the courts. It's not as if the agency is going to grind to a halt tomorrow and nothing's going to get approved, especially things that are far along in development. They're likely to keep on going. The agency is going to continue to review drugs. Things are going to continue to happen. We're not going to see new policies. We're not going to see FDA having the bandwidth to keep up with new science unless something has changed dramatically from the direction that it's going now. Best case scenario is that we have a kind of malaise where things keep happening, but some things are going to be delayed for sure. Some things are going to happen just as they would have without all of these circumstances happening. And then there are likely to be, unpredictable curveballs that get thrown in from time to time. I don't know if that's very much help for people who are listening. The overall story is, look, for the last decade or so, when people were thinking about risk, they were mostly thinking about scientific risk, medical risk, reimbursement risk. They weren't really thinking about regulatory risk. Certainly, there were people who had complaints about decisions that FDA made or that they didn't make. But by and large, it wasn't top of mind for investors or for companies to worry about the competence and the capacity at FDA. And now people have to think about those things.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think that when I talk about the level of concern for many people, especially, you're right, in the VC world and in biotechs, they merge the things going on at FDA with what they're seeing at NIH and with what they're seeing regarding, for example, grant applications featuring mRNA or mRNA vaccines, at the same time as we are seeing the UK and European countries, not to mention China, building facilities for mRNA biomanufacturing. And there's a whole conversation about biomanufacturing in this country. We're basically seeing a whole potential future area of therapeutics with ground being ceded to other countries. At the same time, we know that for any therapeutic, the US remains for the moment the major market. And so there's a lot of confusion over how to think about those technology areas. I don't know whether they're going to now take a hit in terms of investment.
Of course, nobody knows what's going to happen. There's one scenario where policymakers could look at this and see the competitive threat, especially from China, and be persuaded to take actions to bolster confidence in the industry. I'm sure there'll be attempts to do that, and maybe even to enact policies that streamline regulatory barriers, invest in R&D in areas that are going to create more opportunities for growth. There's still a possibility that, people have to remember, look, the administration's only about 50 some odd days old. A lot of things are going to change in the next year or two, for the better or for the worse.
And now for the happy part of the podcast. Okay, Lauren has been waiting in the wings patiently as we discussed all of that. And she's here to tell you about I&I Bispecifics. So I&I companies are finding ways beyond precision medicine to boost responses. One approach, bispecific antibodies that block 2 inflammatory pathways instead of 1. Lauren, you had a nice story on this last week. What did you find?
Thanks, Jeff. So I think the main message about this emerging bispecifics for I&I indications field is that, with cancer, with all of the different bispecific mechanisms that are emerging or have emerged, it's always about this idea of creating novel biology. So you have 2 targets to try to bring the effect of hitting one to a certain tissue, things like that. So you're doing something that you couldn't do by having 2 mAbs against the 2 targets, 2 separate mAbs against the 2 targets. In I&I, at least in the most advanced bispecific programs, and we're not talking about the T-cell engagers, we're talking about the bispecifics that engage 2 inflammatory pathways. This is really about just engaging those 2 pathways in a single compound. This is important in this indication, in this set of indications, because it's actually very difficult to develop, and the commercial incentives are not really there to develop combination biologics for I&I. So, taking 2 mAbs, a combination of mAbs into the clinic, into a phase 2 trial, I've heard from some of the people that I spoke with, would involve incredibly large phase 2 trials. You have to show the contribution that each mechanism is making. You need to do this at multiple doses. It's just a lot of cohorts. It's one of the reasons that we're not seeing combinations move forward in many I&I indications. And now IBD is the exception, and that's just because there haven't been new mechanisms that have been very impressive in that area. But this idea that you could get the same effects or a similar effect by combining two mechanisms in a single antibody-based therapy is really catching on.
That was a very interesting piece you wrote, Lauren, because you really made the point that it's CMC or logistical reasons rather than the science, as it were, that's behind the creation of bispecifics. And maybe talk a little bit also about the dosing advantage, or maybe it's not an advantage, the dosing issue when you have two separate co-administered molecules versus one bispecific. How are companies thinking about that?
Sure. So from a patient perspective, it's obviously better to have one drug that you have to infuse, especially when you're thinking about the dosing schedules and the timelines. They can get complicated if there are two biologics that people need to take. On the bispecific side, the argument against this type of structure has always been that getting the target engagement, the target affinity for both of the targets of these bispecific antibodies right is very challenging. You can't just add more of one of the components to a vial as you could if you were making a co-formulation. You have to actually change the affinity that one of the antibody arms has for its target or one component of the antibody. So what I've heard from companies is that the first step is to go after targets that are very established with the bispecifics that, that you can't really overdose, that if you have too much target engagement, there's not going to be a big safety problem. And that's what we're seeing with a lot of the initial bispecifics in development.
Lauren, I think this is so interesting. I will be interviewing for the BioCentury show this week, Bahija Jalal, the CEO of Immunocore. And they actually also have a construct for I&I where in their bispecific construct, they say one arm tethers the molecule to specific tissues and the other one is binding the antigen. Now, this is a very early stage one. And so this seems to me to be one case where sort of localization is actually giving you a biological advantage, perhaps. I think the idea is that you would have less toxicity by having it be in the right tissues. Is that something that you think sort of could extend to other scenarios, indications?
Yeah, I think that's the hope. I think the first drive into this modality for these indications, again, not talking about the T-cell engagers, was just to get those two mechanisms into one place. I think that's the initial focus, and obviously there's an added benefit if you can create novel biology, as people have done for cancer in I&I. And so what I've heard is just, we haven't seen much evidence at this time that you can do that you can get a benefit that you couldn't get from having the two mAbs separately. That said, I think it's definitely something that people are working on and hopefully something that will emerge as like the next phase of I&I bispecifics.
Right. Thanks, Lauren. And, one of the reasons I went to this very early stage thing was for a shameless plug of our Grand Rounds conferences that are coming up. One in Chicago, June 4th to 6th, and one in September 17th to 19th in Cambridge, UK. What we do in those meetings is really discuss bottlenecks and the next phase of translation, things that could be transformational, where work going on in academia can be leveraged to industry's benefit. And, we are going to be having discussions about bispecifics beyond T-cell engagers, going into other therapeutic areas, and various discussions about I&I, immunology and inflammation, as well as a few other things. You heard this here first because we have not yet disclosed the program and the panels. We'll be doing that soon. But Lauren, I think some of these issues that you're focusing in on are really going to be very central to some of the conversations that are going on at Grand Rounds.
And I am recruiting presenting companies for Grand Rounds US and Grand Rounds Europe, looking for seed, pre-seed, Series A, young companies doing really innovative things in the areas that Simone just discussing. Thank you for that, Lauren. I'll drop a link to your story in the show notes. Steve, Steven, Simone, as always, thanks for joining us. And I look forward to hearing your conversation on our sister podcast, The BioCentury Show. That'll be out on Thursday. Thanks for tuning in. I'll be away next week, but you'll be in very good hands with Stephen Hansen. Kendall Square Orchestra provides the music for BioCentury this week. The group connects science and technology professionals and other members of the greater Boston community to collaborate, innovate, and inspire through music while supporting causes related to healthcare and education.